In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the larger context of hospice and palliative care as it starts to move beyond the UK. And we're going to see that this develops very, very quickly, which tells us that it was meeting an unmet need of some kind, which appeared to have been happening all around the world. And so it gets taken up. We'll talk about this more later in the class, but gets taken up very quickly internationally. But it starts out with, we can see that Dame Cicely Saunders wants to spread the idea. That's very clear, that she sees it as a calling and that she sees it as fulfilling a need, not just in England. And so she starts giving lectures very early on in her research and her kind of practice of early forms of palliative care. And so we're going to be looking at the American case, and then we'll be also looking at the Canadian case. And it's very important to note that it's different in all of these settings, and it has to do obviously with cultural differences, but it also has to do with differences in healthcare systems. And so I want to look at that now. And when we get to the Canadian case, I'm going to be including an article about the founding of universal healthcare, which Canadians tend to take for granted, but which was a battle, as it was everywhere, and says a lot about the culture that we live in. And so I think this history gets lost a lot of the time, and I do want us to look at it, particularly in the Canadian case, when we get there. So the founding of the National Health Service, the NHS as it's usually called in UK, happens in 1948. It's not complete, but it starts out in 1948. It's brought into law, providing full medical care regardless of ability to pay. So of course that's the founding principle that we see in the English system and in the Canadian system. And so we can see this is just shortly after the Second World War. So the Second World War is obviously definitive here, and it's part of a larger social reform movement that had already been taking place in countries like the UK, in England and the UK. And it was galvanized by the Beveridge Report of 1942. And so this is one of the most important documents if we want to talk about social justice in the world. And so this report called for, Beveridge was an economist, and he was calling for a social safety net that would take us from cradle to grave, which is, of course, the system that we strive for in Canada, imperfect as they always are, but this idea that it has nothing to do with how much money you have in the bank. It has to do with your need. And so this comes out of, obviously, a humanitarian impulse. And so Beveridge writes this very, very influential report, which is then taken up by the government of the UK. And so we see that he writes, this is meant to combat the 5 great evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And so this is part of the larger approach to what was going on in the UK following the Industrial Revolution. So we see, not that it's unfamiliar to us today, but huge gaps in income, so lack of income inequality, the growth of cities, and so the spread of disease that we've talked about already in earlier lectures. And so this is attempting to apply a huge social safety net to protect everybody. And so from want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, I find amusing because that's where the Protestant comes in, right? So there's sort of an underlying idea that if we can deal with this, then people will be happy and healthy and working, which is the Protestant ideal. But obviously, the larger impulse is humanitarian, and certainly when we look at Bevan, he was the health minister in England when the NHS was brought in. He was born in Wales into a coal mining family, and so he was very early on politicized and became a Labour Party, very important member of the Labour Party, the left-wing party of England, and then the health minister. And so all these forces are coming into play. So these again, as I've been saying from the beginning, this doesn't drop from the sky. This comes from the strenuous effort of people who often get lost to history, unfortunately, but are very clearly humanitarian. Very early on in this process of developing her ideas about hospice and palliative care, Cicely Saunders begins to travel outside of the UK. So it's very clear that she is interested in, if we want to call it proselytizing, spreading the word, meeting people who are also interested in these issues. And the fact that it spreads so quickly, we're going to be looking at this more later in the course, but it becomes this vast international movement, tells us that she was filling a really important gap in culture. And so she's speaking to a number of different issues, such as, lengthening lifespans, so people dying of chronic illnesses, also attitudes to death and dying that we've already been talking about in this course, the kind of denial of death that hits its zenith in the 1950s and early 60s, and also attitudes towards medicine. So is medicine just a science? Is it just a technique, or is it a humanitarian impulse or even religious impulse? And so all of these factors are coming into play as she starts to move her ideas outside of the UK. And so she made 3 very important visits in the 1960s to the US and Canada, 1963, 1965, and 1966. She appears to have been tireless, and so she goes on an 8-week trip, taking in New York, Yale, Boston, Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Vancouver. And we're told that she visited 18 different hospitals as well as the National Institutes of Health. So the National Institutes of Health in the US are the most important body in terms of healthcare that influence policy. So along the way, she met with doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, social scientists, and hospital chaplains. And so we can see right from the beginning, she is seeing this as an interdisciplinary approach. It's not just about medical doctors. It's about, and I'm afraid this often gets lost. So the idea that it's an interdisciplinary approach and it can be taken from many different angles. So she wrote, I found it a great asset that I was able to go in my threefold capacity of nurse, social worker, and doctor. It made my own approach a broad one and also made me one of them when I discussed problems with each of the different professions. So we can see the way her life experience is influencing her ability to relate to people and to make connections. And so when she's at Yale, this is the point at which she meets Florence Wald, who will be the single most important person in terms of hospice and palliative care in the United States. And I have a separate lecture on her. So we have her own impressions of what happened. So Wald writes, Virginia Henderson was doing an annotated index of all the nursing literature from the 1900s, everything that was written in English. And so when we saw the name Cicely Saunders, she knew what she was doing. I knew nothing about her at all. And she said, well, you must go and hear her. And I said, well, I'm stuck here because I'm supposed to be introducing the speaker at another forum, and I don't feel as if I can get out of it. So she said, well, I'll go and I'll report back to you. So it's arranged that Cicely Saunders will do another talk just for the nursing faculty. And so she says, and so I immediately got in touch with Bernie Litton, and Cicely agreed to meet our students in faculty the next day. And I gathered as many people from the hospital as I could in the departments of social work and so forth, and she did the same presentation. And of course, it wowed us. And then you have to realize that in the same month, in May 1963, that's when the marches of Martin Luther King began in Selma and Alabama. And it was in that summer that doctors and nurses also began to join in the fight against segregation. So that, it found us at a time when the kinds of things that we were suffering, there suddenly seemed to be a way to move. Okay, so we can see explicitly that Wald is linking hospice and palliative care to these larger social movements that are going on in the United States and in many, many parts of the world at that time. And so she sees it as a time when things can change. So while at Yale, this was an incredible trip, obviously, Saunders also met Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Dr. Colin Murray Parks, who both become pillars of this emergent discipline. Many of you, if not all of you, will have heard of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and even people who don't know her name will know of her work. So she is a titan in the field of death and dying. I would imagine that you can't do a course on death and dying and not mention her, and so I want to turn to her work now. So, as I had said earlier, that all roads lead to Cicely Saunders, all roads also lead to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You kind of, the two are very entwined, and as I already said, they did know each other. And so, Kubler-Ross was a Swiss-born psychiatrist who moved to the United States, and she was, you could really argue that she is the founding person who sort of developed the area of death and dying studies. And I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the course, that pretty much every university that I know of has a course on death and dying, and it's sort of taken for granted by students that that's available. Although, as I said, often if you mention it to people outside of the university setting, they'll say, who would take a course like that? And of course we know thousands and thousands and thousands of people would take a course on that. And I think a number of you have taken Dr. Strigley's course, so I'd be interested to hear your comments on the discussion boards about how this ties into this course. And Susan and I have, we've talked a lot over the years, and so these courses have been developed kind of in conversation with each other to some extent. So I would be interested to hear your feedback if you've been doing all of it. We almost have like a sort of a sub-discipline within religious studies at Nipissing. And so she was considered a pioneer in death and dying studies, and she outlined the 5 stages of grief, and I'll get to that. So in 1970, she delivered a series of lectures, the Ingersoll Lectures on Human Immortality at Harvard. And so this became the basis of her further work. So in the early 70s, she was one of the founders of the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. So she's very concerned with death and dying and how that functions, and she's a medical doctor and psychiatrist herself, but she's also interested in grief and how to manage that with sensitivity. And so she played a key role in establishing over 50 hospices globally. So she's linked to the academic study of death and dying, but also to the actual founding of hospice. And this shouldn't be surprising at this point. These people are very philanthropic, and so they're wanting to help actual human beings. They're not just wanting to talk about ideas. And so in 1984, she attempted to launch the world's first prison hospice in California. So she's like Florence Wald in that way. She's interested in social justice writ large. So we're told that by July 1982, she had taught approximately 125,000 students, wow, across various institutions in death and dying courses. So again, like Cicely Saunders, we see she knows this is important and she's trying to spread it to as many people as possible. Now, this part I did not know and is very disturbing. After retiring in 1994 following an arson attack on her home while she was working to establish an AIDS hospice for abandoned babies, she spent her final days in Arizona with her son, Kenneth Ross. And during this period, she authored 4 additional books, including On Grief and Grieving. So we can see that, I didn't know it was this serious, but certainly this was controversial. And I'm going to be talking about some of the controversies when we get to the Nipissing Serenity Hospice in North Bay. But in these early days, we can see clearly she's intersecting with the AIDS epidemic and so on. And so she's running into many types of controversy. So over her career, she published 24 books translated into 44 languages. So we can see she's extremely influential internationally. And her family donated her archives to Stanford in 2019 to ensure that her legacy continued, including the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. So these women were recognized as being very important. Unfortunately, as I think I mentioned, there's very few good resources in terms of documentary or interviews. The quality is not great, but I'm going to use what I have because I do think it's important if we can actually hear from them themselves talking about their work. And now we come to Kubler-Ross's most famous book on death and dying, and this book has never been out of publication since 1969. And it's one of the most influential books of the 20th century and beyond. And as I said, becomes kind of the basis of death and dying studies. And of course, many people in healthcare also will have read this book. I do find the subtitle interesting, and I think it tells us a lot about Kubler-Ross's approach, what the dying have to teach doctors, nurses, clergy, and their own families. So we can see that, like Cicely Saunders, Kubler-Ross is concerned about the whole system. And so that includes family, and that includes all the kind of professions that are intersecting with the dying person. And so the book was based on a study that was instigated by theology students. So it was coming from a religious standpoint, and they signed Kubler-Ross on. I am not clear on Kubler-Ross's religion. I should look into that. But she works with these theology students, and as a psychiatrist and a medical doctor, she's able to interview people and talk to them and give case studies of people. So the book includes examples of people who are dying and what was going on around them and what went well and what didn't. And so she's very like Cicely Saunders in this way. She's working from the patient. She's working from the person who's dying and then developing from that. She's not imposing a theory onto it. And so she's most interested in doing, obviously, what is best for the person who is dying. I want us to look at a section from chapter 1 of her book on death and dying, and it gets to the heart of what she's discussing in the book and what she's most concerned about. And so she's looking at attitudes towards death and dying. And I think it's important to note that in 1969, this was not obvious. This is something that is much more discussed now. And that was partly why I wanted to ask that question about, are we a death-denying society? Because I want to know if things have changed. I think they have to some extent, and I think to some extent they become worse, depends. But certainly in 1969, from where Kubler-Ross was standing, she saw a lot of death denial. So she writes in chapter 1, if we now take a look at our society, we may want to ask ourselves, what happens to man in a society bent on ignoring or avoiding death? So she's saying this is what is happening, certainly in the United States where she's working. It's a society that wants to ignore or avoid death. And so her question then is, what happens to the patient? How does this death denial impact the patient? So what factors, if any, contribute to an increasing anxiety in relation to death? So she's asking the question, does this death denial and avoidance then impact anxiety, which is the question I was asking at the very beginning of the course. What happens in a changing field of medicine where we have to ask ourselves whether medicine is to remain a humanitarian and respected profession or a new depersonalized science in the service of prolonging life rather than diminishing suffering? So here is her philosophy in a nutshell. And this is a question that I want to ask throughout this course, both as people who participate in the medical, I mean, we all do probably at some point, the medical system, and those of you who are working in it, that this is an ongoing tension, and it already was beginning in the time of Florence Nightingale. How much emphasis do we place on the actual technique and the technology, and how much emphasis do we place on the personal aspect? And so hospice and palliative care really develops out of this tension. And is asking the question, is there a way to bring together all of what medical science has to offer with these humanitarian spiritual values? And so obviously Kubler-Ross believes that that can happen. She becomes part of the hospice and palliative care movement. I'm going to end this lecture by looking at Kubler-Ross's most important idea, or at least her most influential idea, which is the 5 stages of grief. So we saw in her biography, this was a central concern of hers, and how people process grief. And so there's been some pushback against this in recent years, saying it's too neat and tidy and not everybody goes through this. I find with great thinkers, there's always pushback, so that's fine. But I think it has maintained itself because it does reflect reality. I think as we move through, you're going to recognize a lot of this. And certainly if you work in healthcare, you're going to recognize a lot of this. So many of you will have already studied this, but I do want to look at the 5 stages of grief. So the first one is denial, We spent the first part of the course talking about denial and the way denial functions in society at large, but also Kubler-Ross is looking within family systems. And so it can be the person dying or the family or both that are in denial. And so this is the stage where the person refuses to accept the reality of the situation. And so this can manifest as refusing to talk about it. And so if the doctor or the family or the nurse tries to bring it up, say what they want, what their end of life wishes are, they'll just shut down the conversation. And so we know this is a basic human mechanism of when something is overwhelming, the psyche just shuts it out. And so often this is a short-term thing, although a person may maintain it right to the end of life. But often it's just a short-term way of coping, just to go into a state of denial and put your head in the sand for a period of time. So the second one is anger, which occurs when the person has accepted the situation, but then they become very angry about it. And so so they can direct this anger in a variety of ways, and I think many people will have experienced this, where anger will be directed towards themselves, towards family members, towards doctors, towards God. So we can see this is very common. I have definitely experienced this, where there's the blaming of the doctor for not preventing the illness or not curing the illness, not giving the proper diagnosis soon enough, etc., etc. Also blaming family members for lack of support. Family members may blame themselves for not giving enough support. They may feel anger toward God or a higher spiritual power. And so, as I said, being religious is not a guarantee regarding how you're going to react to death. For some people, it actually throws them into a crisis of faith. It depends, obviously, on the person. So they may become angry at a variety of people and at God. So this may also manifest as shortness of temper, loss of patience, etc. So this is important for people working or family to expect this and not take it personally. So I think it's actually really helpful to recognize that this is just part of it. The third stage is bargaining. So Harvard Medical School on their website writes, when we experience grief, we often feel hopeless and overwhelmed. It is common to be overcome by statements of what if and if only, as we experience a loss of control over what is happening. During the bargaining stage of grief, a person attempts to negotiate or make compromises. So things like, if only I had brought her to the doctor sooner, so that this is the family blaming themselves, this would have been cured. So a lot of guilt often within family and friends for the fact that the person's ill. If only I had been around more, I would have noticed something was wrong. And so the person themselves maybe begin bargaining with God. So a typical one would be, God, if I become a better Muslim, Christian, Jew, Hindu, will you cure me? So looking for kind of a miracle cure. Or the family may want to bargain with God to bring the person back. So this is I think this is less common. I haven't seen this as often, but definitely it does happen. And then the next one is depression. And so in my experience, these things can all be happening at once. So for instance, a person can go in and out of denial, where they're talking about it openly and then suddenly they go back into denial. So I don't think it's I think it's the steps that aren't necessary. It doesn't necessarily go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These can all be mixing together. So it's obviously unsurprising the person might start to feel depressed and have a feeling of sadness and hopelessness. So the family members may lose interest in activities they normally enjoy, changes in sleep, significant changes in weight, lack of energy, feeling worthless or guilty. These are common symptoms of grief. And this is where I do think a religious lens can be helpful. We've been talking about in the discussion boards about Victorian attitudes to grief. So religious traditions tend to just say, this is what we do. We grieve. This isn't something to be medicalized or you're putting on antidepressants or anything like that. This is a period of time you need to be given to deal with this incredible loss. So I think this is an important part of it, of just respecting that this is how human beings function. And certainly we know our labor laws have no sympathy and they want you back at work within a few days. But that's just not how human emotions work. And so I do think we have to be careful about when we use the word depression, making this into some kind of an illness, which it isn't. It's just a fact of human life, and so we should expect it. And then number 5, acceptance, the period of grief when the person comes to term with the reality. And again, I'm not saying this is neat and tidy, that everybody comes to this. Some people never come to an acceptance. Some people, they do fall back onto their religious beliefs and they accept it and they frame it in a religious way. It depends. And so it's not, I do agree that it's not like it's a checklist and then you're successful if you reach acceptance. But I do think that the context you're in will help. And so this is the whole point of the hospice and palliative care movement and the larger movement, to create an environment where the person can speak openly about their feelings and maybe move more towards this position. If you're living in a death denying society, what's the likelihood you're not going to be in denial? So these 5 stages of grief have been, as most of you will know, been very, very influential. And I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it in the discussion boards if you have worked with these.